Alrighty, welcome. My name is Daniel Beattie, and basically today I'm going to talk to you about disposable architecture. Must admit I'm a bit surprised that there is anybody here. Who went to the TechEd's party last night? Oh, you should all be given an award for being here at 8:15. It's a little bit cruel that I ended up getting the first talk for the actual conference. So hopefully you're all feeling generous and mark me really well for being brave enough to take on the first talk for the session. For the conference. Sorry, there's still a few more people just coming in. A couple of seats down the front, guys. Squash in. While people are setting, just wouldn't mind asking if people can just sort of indicate the type of roles that they're in. Just want to get a bit of an idea. So maybe if we start with who actually in the room is an acting architect? Tough crowd, all right. How about an aspiring architect? Cool. All right, you guys will be easy to please, hopefully. And someone, a business sponsor or somebody who's actually responsible for architectural outcomes? Cool. All right, well, you guys will probably enjoy it the most, I hope. All right, so just a bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. So I won't go into any great detail, but essentially the big question, what is disposable architecture? Now, I'm not going to answer that for you right now, but the term itself is quite interesting. It's by its very nature quite a confronting term. So I think there's plenty of architectural patterns out there that people can go into any bookstore and essentially 50 books on the shelf and, so why have something new? But the term itself, disposable architecture, is really to evoke a response in people, and we'll hopefully explore that, and hopefully it's understandable at the end of this. Something else is very important. When does disposable architecture become indisposable? So like all good patterns and practices, they're not applicable everywhere. So I'm going to talk a little bit about when do you actually use the alternatives. Sorry mate, there's a bit of feedback on this microphone. The diseconomies of scale. I'm sure we've all heard of the economies of scale, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the opposite of that and how that applies mainly to IT projects and specifically architecture. Are we at the project tipping point? So I'll share a couple of stories, and I'm sure you've all got some of your own where projects have got to that point where you're asking yourself, is it really worth going ahead? But for some reason, it just still does. Architecture debt, another term. It's probably not really used a lot, the word debt, in regards to architecture and IT projects, but I think we'll explore that essentially all projects at some stage become debt and they become legacy, regardless of how great they were originally. There's a few seats, guys, down the front. Still people coming in. Just put your hand up if you've got a spare seat beside you so the rest of the crew can find a seat. These are the guys that actually went to the party and stayed later than everybody else. Wow. Oh, also I suppose it's fair to say that either the other tracks are really boring or you guys are really excited about architecture. So, people still feeling, all right, cool. All right, closed up. Where were we? Okay, so we've just spoken about a little bit about architectural debt. How do I adopt disposable architecture? So my hope is that at the end of the session today, you're all really excited and think that some of the principles and thoughts that I share with you are applicable in your organisations. So I'm just going to go through, well, where are some of the places that you can start to adopt this? And the sweet spots, so how do you actually promote the idea of disposability in your organisation? And where are the most likely candidates for that to be taken up? And just a bit of a cheat sheet, which hopefully just reinforces the message that I'm sharing with you today. Now, if at any stage I actually walk into the projector view, I'm going to go blind for a couple of seconds because the light's extremely bright. So that's why I'm hovering over here. Just a bit of a quote. One of my favourite authors, Ricardo Semler. I've modified his quote, but basically, there is no such thing as a perfect architectural decision. It's just opinions, all depending on where you're standing in time. Now, I'm sure the architects in the room where you've started a new company and you're talking with your existing architecture team, and they're sharing with you all their great patterns and their principles and all the things that they've done. And from your perspective, because of what you've gone through and what you've experienced, it doesn't seem, as good as what they're promoting. Or vice versa, you've got ideas that they don't necessarily agree with. So I guess what I'm trying to point out here is that architecture is a very subjective subject. Like most IT projects, it's very complex. There's a lot of inputs, and there are a lot of things that go into making architectural decisions. And my own little quote, so not 10, not 5, maybe 2 years. It wasn't that long ago that most projects had an ROI timeframe of 5 to 10 years. I think that's changing rapidly. I'm not sure, I'll be interested in your feedback at the end of this. This is not supposed to be completely one way. At the end when we talk, I'd really appreciate your feedback, even if it disagrees with things I've said. But the pressures that I've been under in the organisations that I've been working in is pretty much budgets are no longer growing. You can't just go out and buy these big systems that are supposedly going to fix all of our problems. You really have to be smarter and reduce scope, but still deliver business value. Okay, so what is disposable architecture? Well, primarily, it's actually a language to communicate with your business. Architecture itself, in a traditional sense, usually is reams and reams of documentation. So you might have an enterprise architecture framework. You might have a common message model. People talk about SOA. People talk about point-to-point. All of these different languages that essentially has grown up around the idea of developing solutions. But if you think about a business engagement, which is really what architecture is all about, business outcomes, you really need to be able to communicate with your business. And if they're not on board, if they don't understand the things that you're talking about, they're not necessarily going to buy into the project. And so therefore, they're not actually going to feel part of it either. And a very important thing in any delivery is that all the stakeholders actually feel like they're part of that, part of the process. And so it's not really enough to have a conversation with a business, whether it's a business architect or a business analyst, go into your ivory tower and basically come back with this really complicated solution. That's something that architects tend to do because it's something that they're comfortable with, sitting with other peers, other people that speak the same language as them. So what I hope to give you today is some terminology, some safe terminology that you can use so that when an opportunity comes up, when it's a program of work that you think disposable architecture might actually assist, you can talk with your business and get sponsorship and the things that you need to be successful. It's also thinking with the end in mind. If you think the term disposable, it's like I said, it's provocative. It's actually meant to jolt you out of thinking, this is going to be my Picasso moment. I have this project, I'm going to implement the biggest, baddest system I can find. Why? Because I love IT, I love technology, I want to do what I want to do. And so the idea here is, well, if you stop for a moment and just think, what am I going to do to get rid of this system? What are the things that I need to be aware of? Because everything is a legacy eventually. I don't think that anybody has ever deployed a solution into an organisation that hasn't at some stage become a legacy because new technologies come along so rapidly now. And if you think iPhone, Windows Phone 7, basically the whole smartphone, they're all thinking with the end in mind. 18-month contracts, you're going to get a new phone. They don't sell you a 10-year phone. It's just not viable. Their whole business model is around the idea that the moment they release the phone, they're already working on or have been working on the release for 18 months, in 18 months' time for some time, tying up suppliers and all those things. The way that they allow you to dispose of the phone in an appropriate way is their funding model. They basically set the contract around the idea that you get a free upgrade in 18 months' time, or they classify it as free. But if you purchase that phone outright at the start and you paid $1,000 for it, after 18 months you might not feel like you could actually just give it away. I know that when I first got my Windows Phone 7 and my first iPhone and what have you, it was like a joy to use. when the second model came out, I just give it away. People just don't care after that point. And so they've actually built the end in mind into their whole model. And that's why I think they're largely that market's really taken off. All right, so acronyms. You can't have an architecture talk without some acronyms.
It's not really the same as software. Like, if the software application that costs the organization $1 million, they don't want to dispose of that in 2 years. They want to keep it for 10 years, probably.
Yep.
Or even 15 or 20, whatever. Remember year 2000? Software for that was built 30 years before.
Of course.
So mobile phone is different because given the volume of manufacturing, you can buy one for $10. Maybe in 2 years there will be 5 or 2 or 1 or 0 or 2 or 3.
Sorry, mate. Look, I'm listening to what you're saying. Yeah. Allow me to go through the talk, and at the end we've got 15 minutes.
Software is a different comparison.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
No, and I appreciate that, and I think that's part of what hopefully, as I get through the slides. But feel free to bring that up at the end. And we'll have 15 minutes at the end, or maybe a little bit more. So please hold your comments until then, just so that we can flow through the conversation and basically allow everybody to contribute. Okay, so DA is to SOA like Agile is to waterfall. So disposable architecture, service-oriented architecture. If you think back 10 years, when waterfall was pretty much the predominant development methodology in most organisations, and to a large degree it still is in some, basically it was a one-approach-fits-all situation. The idea was that you gather all your requirements up front, you do all your heavy lifting from day one, and the idea was it would cost you less further down the track. But I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that Agile, as it has matured and the frameworks and the supporting tools around it has matured as well, that there's also a place for Agile in development, even in massive projects. It's no longer big end of town uses waterfall and little end of town uses Agile. There's actually a blend. And so what I'm basically suggesting here, and I'm using as just one architectural pattern, is that disposable architecture is to SOA like Agile is to waterfall. They actually can work together, and there's components of each in both, and they're also useful in different situations. So that's my next point. A lot of people in the audience are architects, as you put your hand up and indicated, and so basically I'm not in any way, shape or form saying that traditional architecture is not relevant. I'm not in any way saying that you shouldn't still be able to build 10-year solutions, as this guy at the front was pointing out, if that's what your intention is. But I think you'll find that as we essentially go through these slides, that people aren't interested when they're given the opportunity to invest in 10-year solutions anymore. I shouldn't say people, most people. And the final point, I believe, is it puts business enablement first, technology purity second. It's very easy for organisations to centralise around or adopt a framework or a set of technologies. And at the time, it seems like the right thing to do because there are all these, I guess, vendor bits of media and what have you that suggest, well, if you adopt just one type of technology, you're going to reduce costs on training, support, all those type of things. But when you put business enablement first, you're actually opening up yourself to the opportunity that if something better does come along, you don't necessarily say no because it doesn't necessarily fit within the framework that you're used to. Actually, the final point, so I was going to grab a drink. Ratification of what's already happening today. If I can get a show of hands of people who have actually implemented an MS Access solution at some stage in their career. Sweet, all right, so about 60-70%. I've seen some of the most amazing business enablers written in Access and Excel. And when you think purely from the term business enablement, now that means a couple of different things. You can always have the utopian solution, which let's say if you're looking on a scale of 1 to 10 is a 10. So that's a fully worked enterprise holistic solution. And then you've got your Access database, which most architects and risk teams would say is a 0. What I'm suggesting is that disposable architecture is somewhere in the middle. It's not the holy grail. It doesn't solve every single problem. But what it allows you to do is to provide the same sort of benefits that businesses get from Access and Excel, which is rapid deployment, which is the ability to make changes themselves. It's cheap, and it just works a lot of the time. And of course, there's always the exceptions where it doesn't, and there's always a group of people that will claim that's the reason you don't do it. But essentially what I'm looking to do is establish a safe place in the middle, because the budgets don't always exist. And the amount of front office risk that I'm aware of when I work in organisations that basically the back office team just doesn't want to acknowledge. So you've got mission critical systems. I've seen loan systems, I've seen insurance systems, LVR ratios, things like that, some really complex stuff done in Access databases. And you really have to take your hat off to some of these business people that have no support, no one in the organisation that's prepared to get down beside them and say, you know what, we're going to help you with this. But they still produce these fantastic solutions. They might not be architecturally pure, but they achieve the business outcome. And there's a real trend that I'm seeing in the organisations that I'm working in where businesses are going outside the process more and more. They're being proposed by SaaS operators, utilities, Azure, cloud type stuff. No longer do they need to go to their traditional IT departments and say, build me a server. They can log on with their credit card and they have access to a server. And so really, there's going to be a larger and larger divide between the purity of architecture and the forces of business. And hopefully what we get from today is that you can actually find a spot in the middle, and it's about disposability. Okay, so when does it become indisposable? So you've all probably familiar with the term tactical versus strategic. It's a pretty famous way for teams to basically say, we're not going to hit our deadlines, or we don't know how to solve this problem strategically, so we're going to implement something that's tactical. Now, that's often seen as a bit of a bad thing. People often refer to, well, look, it's just the tactical solution. But the irony is, if you were to survey most people who have been the recipient of a tactical solution that was delivered a lot more quickly than the strategic, oftentimes it actually results in a pretty positive outcome. And I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that tactical doesn't necessarily have to be rough and dirty. It can still be an effective approach. Situational apps. So I was working in an organisation and basically they had a typical CRM problem. 50-odd business departments, not really talking to each other, not necessarily the same customer base, but a pretty complementary customer base across this organisation. And basically the business said, we need a CRM. I've read in CIO magazine that CRMs change the way businesses operate, so let's go out and get a CRM, which is pretty typical. So it's a pretty large company, like I said, 50 business units, so there's a lot of different forces at play. So what do? Well, okay, you need to put together a steering committee, a product selection committee, your architects go in and talk to your business units. Basically this happened, built this team, 20, 30 people after a couple of weeks' time, and somebody said, hey, we've adopted SOA in this organisation moving forward, so not only are we implementing a CRM, but it has to apply to the SOA principles. But that sort of got watered down a little bit because SOA is one of those interesting things. It's a principle, but it's also, in many people's minds, an implementation. Hey, have you got a SOA infrastructure? Well, what does that mean? Oh, I need an enterprise service bus. I need a message broker. I need a versioning, message versioning. I need a common message model. There's all of these artifacts that go along with the idea of SOA. And so basically what happened is this project ballooned, like most do, into it has to do everything for the organisation and it has to be done using a SOA middleware product. So we've got vendors basically jostling for, buy 20 of our servers, it will basically revolutionise your organisation. Throw in a BPM server as well, whatever else we can basically throw at you. So as this was going on, 6 months down the track, pretty much zero progress had been made from a business perspective. There'd been plenty of technical progress, there'd been plenty of artifacts that had been created, and people in the team and working on this project were really quite excited. They were getting to have arguments in the big boardroom because it was such an important project. It had to be sort of moved up a couple of levels about message models. Do we use an Anglo-Saxon approach where we've got first name, middle name, and last name? Really important, supposedly, and you can tie up hundreds and hundreds of hours or thousands of hours arguing about these things. And your poor business is still waiting for some sort of contact, some sort of, hey, are you going to actually solve this problem? But interestingly, the business didn't ask for a CRM. It was actually IT. It was the CIO type group. It was the infrastructure people. It was basically the technology group leading the business down a path. They did the pitch. They got the money. They got the funds, 20 plus 30 million or whatever it was initially. So basically, I was brought on because a couple of the business units had compliance requirements. And one of those compliance requirements was around essentially recording customer data, which, you know, is a CRM type of scenario. So I put together a bit of a hit team, some of the really good developers, and we basically spent 6 weeks dealing with this individual business unit. And in 6 weeks, we built what we refer to as a situational app. So we were very aware of the strategic 3 to 5 year CRM project. But in 6 weeks, we were able to build and deploy into a production environment with a couple of iterations using Agile and all the cool development frameworks, MVC, those type of things. We were able to build a situational app that actually solved the problem for that business unit. So as I said, there was a compliance deadline, some big fines associated with not complying. So all of the, we're going to do it this way, was thrown out the door because this big fine. And we were able to do it in a disposable way. And that's sort of where part of a lot of these thinkings come from, is human nature is to have the idealistic view of the world. We're going to go and do this. But inevitably, as you're moving along, things come up. And you need to be flexible. You need to be able to change and adapt for that. And so the interesting thing about that deployment was that the business actually worked with us directly on the project, which is fantastic. Because it was disposable, we didn't end up with a list this long of requirements. They were very reasonable. Because the time frame was short and the development effort was low, their appetite for risk was greater. They didn't actually feel like they were going to invest millions of dollars. And it wasn't. It was, you know, tens of thousands at best to have this situational app. Interestingly though, when we were building this app, we weren't ignorant of the fact that we still need to make sure that we master our data correctly if we are going to do that. A customer is a customer is a customer is what people will often say. And so as we were working with this business unit, they just so happened to be in an area where they had a lot of frontline new customer information coming in. And so we established that, like the software term convention over configuration, I'll just quickly explain that for people who are not sure. Basically, the idea is that if you build software that follows a certain pattern, whether it's naming conventions, placement of controls and what have you, the framework itself picks those things up and brings them together and actually creates an interface for you. So Microsoft.NET ASP.NET MVC3, for example, you use naming conventions on your controller, on your views, and it brings those things, or it dynamically binds those things based on the convention. So we used that same principle with our data. Our thoughts were, if we're saving data about a customer in our situational app, it's over here, you've got the strategic solution to the left that's sort of maybe 10% done. As long as we follow a convention that they can import, the moment that that strategic solution is viable, then that data can just be moved across. So data is king. The app is disposable, but the data's not. And by following a convention over configuration, basically what we're saying is we don't want to be configuring all of these transformation layers. We don't want to store customer data for this business unit and then have to translate it for this business unit and then have to translate it for this business unit. We basically want to follow a convention, and essentially that's non-negotiable. So it's a very important point that if you are going to implement something like this, you do need to be able to follow a convention. And the next piece is that good architecture isn't about good technology, it's about good business outcomes. Now, the great business outcome about this was other business units that didn't necessarily have compliance deadlines had seen the success of this first situational project. So they came to this team and said, look guys, we know that the strategic solution is probably 3 years away. We're not really hearing good things out of that group from a timeline perspective. We want to be productive today. We want to engage your group and fund you to basically copy and paste what you've just done and change a few fields. Because if you think about 90% of businesses, especially large businesses, is somebody at a desk doing the same thing over and over again. Maybe receiving a phone call writing some information, following up with somebody else, sending off a workflow request, responding to a workflow request. Most people's jobs, not probably in this room, but in a business sense, are situational. And so what we found, and this was the really nice business outcome, is that over the next 6 to 12 months, we rolled out 10 of these situational apps that were essentially take a copy of the existing source code, everything, so we're not trying to create artifacts here, paste, modify the appropriate code. We even had tools to do that for us in the end. And basically, within a couple of weeks, we could roll out full CRM functionality for each business unit that required it. And so they were productive straight away. Their ROI was almost immediate. Now, it doesn't mean that strategic solution isn't a better holistic option. But if you compare, like I said before, the Access database on a network drive that's open to everybody, or the Excel spreadsheet, or in some cases, I worked with an insurance company where they actually were still using a scrapbook in the call centre. New customers would come in, they'd write the information on a scrapbook and share it around the room. So if you take that as a 0 and you take the full enterprise-wide CRM as a 10, what I'm talking about here is probably a 5. It's backed up. It's a back office risk. It's no longer a front office risk that nobody knows about. It's not perfect, but it actually solves the business problem. And that's what that point's about, is good business outcomes. And I think this point is often overlooked. It's very difficult to consider a business outcome when you're a technology person because we understand the intrinsic things that are going on in the background. But an interesting dilemma occurred also as we were cruising along and developing these apps. So originally, after the third business unit came along, they basically said, look, we want to access some corporate data. So the enterprise data warehouse is traditionally the place that people will go to and say, hey, I want to bring back some piece of information that's pretty much available to everybody. The problem is that the EDW was also a strategic project. And so they didn't actually have the data that we required in the EDW at this stage. That was coming in Q5, Q20. You know, people are always pushing things out. So basically what that meant was that we had to look elsewhere. And we found a good old SQL server that had been sitting there for quite some time that basically had this data and it was updated from a mainframe ETL every night. So the first sort of idea was, well, let's implement some SOA principles here. Let's service enable this data because it's something that's going to be shared across pretty much every business unit. It's very common. When we actually approached the traditional architectural team and delivery group, basically we're told, yes, that's on the roadmap, but once again, we're talking 12, 18 months, maybe 2 years away. That wasn't suitable for us. So what we did was, we then went back to the DBAs and said, we want to access this database. And what do you think they said? You're laughing because you know that the response was, well, we're going to have to do analysis on load. We're going to have to look at security. We're going to have to look at all these very important things. Now, this was just pretty common, almost data that anybody can get access to. It was like publicly available data. It just happened to be the most accurate version of that. So in the end, we're looking at about a 5-week project for the database team, essentially, to provide this data. So we said, look, what we're going to do is we're going to bypass you altogether, and we're going to piggyback off the ETL that's coming out of the core system, so the pure source of data, and create a cached copy for our application. Now, once again, from a pure architecture perspective, mastering data outside of a system is a real big no-no. It's not a great idea to have a replication of data. But what this enabled us to do, and if you think back to the disposability aspect, in a very short amount of time, we were able to create a cached copy of the data that would only ever be a day old at most. The business were fine with that. They had no problem at all. From their perspective, it was better than the 15-year-old spreadsheet they were using. And we didn't have to do load testing on any of the other infrastructure in the organisation. We could just do load and stress and volume testing on our infrastructure because it was a situational app. We weren't actually going to create a service where you might have 50 different business units using it, where you need SLAs and all those things. But we had the same outcome. We essentially had real-time or one-day delayed access to a piece of corporate data. But the next problem was that the business units were getting so excited by the rate of delivery that they started to, I suppose, entertain the idea of chaining the apps together. What if we could take data from one of these disposable apps and situational apps and display it in a new app and draw that information together so that we could start to have a holistic view. And this is where we said no. Basically, whenever a request came in where they wanted to have disposable apps or disposable solutions that actually relied on each other, you're essentially broken the pattern and it becomes an anti-pattern. And so there is caveats. Like all good patterns, it's not applicable everywhere and it's going to have limits. But interestingly, that business unit had that requirement, was 1 out of about 40. And so this pattern was applicable to potentially 40 business units across this organisation. And the irony is that, 3.5 years later, the strategic solution eventually did get implemented for one business unit or one business domain. It became so expensive and so prohibitive because of all of that effort up front and the adoption of SOA at the same time and all of the other things that basically go on these ambitious projects, that those situational apps are still running and are being very effective for those business units.
But isn't there a danger?
Sorry, mate, look, can we talk? Look, can we please bring the questions up at the end? It's just that I'm trying to get through my slides. The diseconomies of scale. Okay, so we're all familiar with the term economies of scale. If I build 10 widgets, it costs me $100 each. If I build 20, it costs me 80. Basically, I build 100, it might cost me 10. Now, that was the old Henry Ford and the old manufacturing way of thinking. The idea was the larger the investment, the cheaper per unit cost. I think you'll find, though, that with IT projects specifically, architecture development, actually the opposite is true. One person who has the appropriate skills can do far more for the units of time than 10 people for the equivalent units of time. And what you'll find is that when you have 10, you actually spend a lot more time talking about the project than actually working on it. You get a real duplication of effort. Large projects, which predominantly I'm talking about, you tend to get specialised teams that essentially are given KPIs and are responsible for certain areas. You might have a test manager. You might have a situational manager. You might have a data quality and data cleansing manager. You have all these people that essentially come into the team, hire in a lot of contractors potentially. And what you end up with is this massive duplication of effort. Although the first team that I mentioned, one of the teams is responsible for 10% of the project, there might be a 5% bleed with another team. And you don't often get collaboration or cooperation because of the KPIs that are set up. You are responsible for this specific piece. You also get a massive increase in communication overheads. How many of you have worked on a project with 100 people in the whole project? Cool. All right, not as many as I thought. Basically, when that happens, you get massive amounts of emails all the time, basically describing what's going on in the project. The communication overheads are huge. You actually have communication experts that often are involved in the project, and their job is just to communicate with the broader audience. Also slows down the decision paths. Basically, when you've got a small disposable project and your business unit is fully engaged with you, if you go to them and say, look, this is how we want to do this, you share with them the risk, the pros, the cons, and what have you, you almost get a decision on the spot or within a couple of days. When you take on these strategic enterprise-wide projects that are holistic and every single business unit needs to be consulted, you might be waiting weeks for decisions. And often you get this idle effect where you've got all these resources waiting to do something, but the decision hasn't been made yet because people are paralysed by the enormity of the decision that they think they're making, the investment that they've already had in the investment in the project. Also, value doesn't go up because you spend more. So you might look at a $1 million solution and you might look at a $10 million solution. Just because it's 10 doesn't mean you're going to get more value. And you also have to deliver 10 times as much value on that investment to earn that back. And it's one thing to sort of be, once again, optimistic, but think of the upside for the organisation. But businesses, including IT, is just profit and loss. You spend the money, it's got to be earned back. And I think my experience in the last couple of years is that gone are the days of seeing IT as just a cost that has to be spent. Businesses are now saying, how does this affect our bottom line? If I can go out and hire 3 new salespeople instead of investing this big solution, I might actually get a better outcome. Not a better technology outcome, but a better business outcome. And so we don't, as architects, have a monopoly anymore over the business in regards to technology choices. They're getting smarter, there's more information out there for them, and basically they're being a lot more savvy. Okay. If you've worked on big projects, and it doesn't have to be 3 to 4 years, it can be smaller depending on the size of your organisation. But regardless of the timeframes, if you're into the project and you start asking yourself the question, what was our business intent? If I go back to my previous example about the CRM and the SOA project, basically the SOA team didn't have a business intent. Well, they sort of did. Agility, flexibility. That's the promise of SOA, is that basically my business can turn on a dime, and essentially we can enable them to continue to operate without investing large sums of money. But there's many, many ways of actually achieving that goal. And I'll be interested, I did this talk in New Zealand just last week, and there was probably twice as many people in the room, and I asked the question, I'll ask it here as well, is how many people have been part of a large SOA project that's been successful? If I can get a show of hands. You know what? I had one person in New Zealand as well, out of 250 odd people. Now that's not because SOA is not great. I actually think SOA is probably one of the best architectural patterns that has come along in the last 10 years. It's a fantastic way of looking at business problems. The problem is though, that SOA becomes a project as opposed to SOA the principles, which is about decoupling your business needs, basically separation of concerns, just good development practices at a higher level. Very common. We can't stop now. We've already spent so much. If you've spent 50% of your budget and you have 0 return, you've got to spend the other 50 to get something. It's amazing how often the projects become finance-driven. They start off technically driven because the architecture team and the designers and what have you had a vision that was great. Hey, we're going to do this amazing thing. But we're hopeless at actually budgeting things. We're hopeless at estimation. I don't think I've ever estimated anything correctly when it comes to an IT spend. But the interesting thing is, if I build a disposable app, and let's say my budget's 100 grand, and I'm 50% wrong, what's 150, potentially? If I build a enterprise-wide app, or if I implement an enterprise-wide app, and my budget's 10 million, and I get that 50% wrong, that's 15 million. Massive, massive difference. So what I'm hoping that the message that you're getting is, I'm not bashing architecture. I'm not saying that people are doing it wrong. It's that money is real in architecture. It's actually one of the things that people often don't think about. They might ask the question, well, what's our budget? But you've got to actually live and breathe that and realise, hey, if this was my money, what would I be going for? And I can guarantee you, no, I can't guarantee you, I should say, 9 times out of 10, my experience is that if you give a business the opportunity to buy something today that's 1/10 of the cost, but probably does 50% of the features, but you say to them, I'm going to get back to you in 18 months, we're going to throw this away, and we're going to build another one, because it only cost us 1/10, so now we're at 2/10. 9 times out of 10, they'll say, you know what, I'm pretty interested in that, because we're probably going to have a different team that has different requirements in 2 years' time. They're going to want to be involved in the project themselves, so you're going to have a higher level of sponsorship. And who knows what amazing technologies are going to exist in 2 years that we're just not even aware of. 2 years ago, people were still building servers in their organisations. Pretty much people say you're crazy if you don't virtualise or cloud. So, the marketplace is changing. Imagine if you invested 3 years ago millions and millions of dollars in infrastructure, and then 6 months later, Microsoft releases a cloud-based product, or IBM or whoever, and you've got all this capital tied up in this system. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't invest in infrastructure. It doesn't mean that you made a mistake. But it's just typical of the IT industry that things move so quickly. Anybody who claims today that they know what the solution is in 3 years is probably kidding themselves. Like, seriously, we just don't know what's going to be around in 3 years' time. I've been asked recently, I worked on a Connect project. One of my other talks was the Connect. 2 years ago, it wasn't even more than an entry page on the Microsoft Research Labs website. Organisations now are asking consultants basically to architect solutions around different user interfaces. Connect, completely touchless. When the iPad came out, all the rage was touch-based devices, and I'm sure that will continue. But imagine if you architected a solution that only addressed that, and then the Connect comes along, which people wouldn't have even thought was possible, and all of a sudden, you've invested all this money and all this energy, and the business says, you know what, iPads, so yesterday, I'm interested in gesture-based interfaces. Now, that's not every organisation. There's always a combination, but it's just something to keep in mind. Another really good comment that people make is, don't worry about it, we'll amortise it. So basically what that's saying is, you know what, we've spent so much, we're not going to expense it this year, we're going to break it up over the next 4 or 5 years. What's not often understood with that scenario is that that amortisation comes out of your future budgets. So from an IT person, you might feel really good today because you just deployed a really, really massive solution. But the fact is, next year, your training budget's cut by 1/7 or whatever because of the amortisation. And eventually, if you do this enough, and most organisations fall in this trap, 3 or 4 years worth of amortisation becomes the whole budget. And you have nothing left, or very little, but you're still being expensed. So all that value you created 3 years ago, when you implemented that big solution, is no longer being registered by your business, but you're still paying for it. You're still being expensed. And so as a group, an architectural group, you're basically being told, well, why is it that IT is so expensive? And you say to them, yeah, but look at this system. No, that's just a core system. We're not talking about that. We want this. We want new things. What have you guys been doing? And the real clincher for me is, if you're an architect in an organisation, designer, what have you, and basically you come to your project team, it might be your CIO or someone a bit lower, your architectural manager, and you put forward a better way of doing it that isn't part of the project, but the outcome can be achieved, and it's ignored. Well, you've got to ask the question, am I really being an architect? Because I don't think architecture is about starting a project and then ending it regardless. It's actually about identifying, well, what is the intent of the architectural engagement? The business has engaged our group, the business has engaged us for an outcome, not for a project. Now, it's not easy to do, and I've had my head kicked in a few times for doing that type of thing. But I think you'll find that the more that you actually are able to build sponsorship with your business and essentially realise that they're funding everything that goes on, it's not actually the IT department that's funding these things, the opportunity to implement disposable architecture will grow. Architectural debt. So I've created architectural debt, and I actually think that all architecture becomes debt eventually. Every single system is going to have to be decommissioned at some stage. Now, I worked recently with an insurance organisation that had a mainframe that had been there for 25 years. It was basically the old green screen. And interestingly, for 7 years, they tried to get budget to decommission the system and replace it with something else. But every time, the business benefit didn't justify the cost. The reason the cost was so high was because of the debt that system had created. On one hand, it had lasted 25 years, which is great. But on the other hand, there were so many things that were hanging off it that nobody knew about, that the documentation had been lost in the eons of time, that they were scared to touch it. You know, it was almost like it was a relic that you couldn't walk past, because if you bumped it, it would stop working, and who knows what would happen to the business. Another interesting part about architectural debt, and I've worked on 3 SOA projects, and it was interesting that only one person in the room has been part of a successful SOA project. SOA projects, as opposed to SOA principles, create massive amounts of architectural debt. You think about a new project that comes on board. When you've adopted SOA principles and a SOA project, you've got to get a return on investment on your ESB, your message broker, all of these things that you've spent millions of dollars on. How do you do that? Well, you basically charge business units for it. So business units basically say, you know what, I want this project done, and the architects say it has to go through our SOA infrastructure. And there's a cost associated with that. The business says, well, I don't want to pay that. Why would I want to pay for something that is effectively more? And the reason it's more is because of all the things that support it. The versioning systems, the middleware bloat that you have, the load balancing, the redundancy. There's all of these extra pieces that basically are there just to support that infrastructure. Now, I'm not an advocate for point-to-point type architecture, but the fact is sometimes it's the right way to go. It's not always the best way to go through a SOA channel. Questions not often asked is, what am I really signing our organisation up for? You know, basically, as usually a very intelligent group of people comparative to the rest of the business in an organisation, architects and designers are able to understand the technology that they're implementing. It's very easy to forget, and I do this when I'm talking. I've done a couple of technical talks recently, and with my Connect talk, I forgot to tell people that it basically plugs in with a USB port into my laptop. Now, it seems very, very obvious to me because I'm using technology all the time, but there was someone in the audience that was really interested, and they came up to me and said, oh, so how does this Connect talk to your computer? And I'm like, wow, what an obvious thing for me to miss. So, you know, there's different levels of understanding. When you, as a very smart person, take on an architectural pattern that's very complex and has a lot of artifacts associated with it, you've got to ask yourself the question, if I'm not here or other people like me aren't here, how is the organisation going to use these things? I rocked up at a large organisation a couple of years back, and they had the best enterprise architecture framework that I've ever seen. It was basically encyclopedia thick of every single pattern that you could think of to basically implement an organisation. It was extremely well written. It was just an amazing piece of work. It had fortress boundaries, you know, business capability models, all of these great architectural artifacts. But this organisation just merged, and basically what happened is that the more stronger or powerful developers and architects in the team, or the merged entity, overrode this great documentation and artifacts. And so they sat there and collected dust. Now, these documents could have been dropped into any organisation and been useful. They were more like a piece of art. They were fantastic. But the interesting thing is, the people who implemented those projects and spent years doing it didn't ask the question, what am I really signing our company up for? How are they going to take advantage of these artifacts? Who's going to be here in 5 years' time, 2 years' time? And so unless you're getting value out of those artifacts now, it's often not necessarily a useful investment. Now, this is something that you probably never hear, especially from middleware SOA type practitioners. Who here has got a bit of an idea of how much it costs to implement, let's say, a 10 million transaction per week SOA infrastructure?
More than any company is able to.
Maybe not any company, but pretty close. Look, there are companies that pretty much can do whatever they want. They're just massive. You know, you think of the big banks, to a large degree, they have guaranteed budgets. But you're right. The problem with SOA in this regard and how it relates to disposable architecture is that disposable architecture is one step. I have business problem, I have solution. There's nothing in between. You know, you still need good developers, you still need good practices, you still need good testing, all the things that you need. With SOA, there's a couple of different maturity models out there, but basically you might have 9 steps. Organisations spend so much money getting to step 2 or 3, which is basically the infrastructure and learning, that they run out of puff. The last 6 steps, or 3, depending on the type of maturity model, just never get realised. And so all the value that you were promised for getting to step 9 is never realised. Instead, what you have is a really nice set of principles, but essentially maybe 1 or 2 business units using that infrastructure and paying the whole thing. As I said before, I love SOA. I think if you adopt SOA principles in your organisation as opposed to a SOA infrastructure, you'll go a long way. It's a really, really good pattern. And disposable architecture works within that. So those situational apps that I mentioned, they were using SOA principles. service-enabled, REST-based, things like that. Message definitions. The other interesting thing is, if it's so expensive to set up, chances are it's going to cost a whole lot more to maintain. We're optimists. We assume that we buy the big expensive solution. Why? Because it means less maintenance down the track. When I started rolling out my situational apps, the first thing that the architect team said to me was, well, who's going to maintain these? You're just rolling out 10, 15, 20 apps across the organisation, proliferation of apps, we're trying to reduce the number of applications, blah, blah, blah. Same sort of all conversations I'm sure you've all heard. Interestingly, after 12 months of these apps running, there was only like 3 or 4 help desk calls. Why? Because they were situational. They did what they were asked to do. They weren't all things to all men, and so therefore we didn't have the same sort of support problems that you do in these really large applications. And also because they're not expensive to set up, if I spend 20, 30 grand on an app, and I'm a big company, let's say I've got 1,000 employees, or a medium company, I can throw that away. It doesn't matter, 20 grand, that's, you burn that in a meeting. So by keeping your cost base really, really low and basically creating them disposable, you're not wedding yourself to it. And so therefore, if it needs to be replaced by a strategic or another situational app, go ahead. If the return on the investment's there, then do it. How do I adopt disposable architecture? Okay, so think differently. 10 years ago, basically everything was about boilerplate code. If you were a developer 10 years ago, you were writing ORMs, you were writing logging frameworks, you were writing authentication, authorization, personalization, the list goes on. All these features that we have for free today. Basically, you pick up any framework, whether it's Microsoft, Java, PHP, whatever, they've all got 101 applications out of the box that have most of these things. Microsoft has done so much work on scalability, security, all those type of things. So if you're actually going to build something 10 years ago, you're going to have a very, very different approach. The problem with architect teams, to a degree, is a lot of architects come from development backgrounds. 10 years ago, when I was a developer, which I was, and now I'm an architect. So therefore, I'm going to draw on those experiences of 10 years ago. So what I'm encouraging architects to do, and the whole business, is differently. If you go to a developer today and say, how much boilerplate code do you write? If they say any, then they're probably not doing their job. We shouldn't be writing boilerplate code, and we shouldn't be architecting boilerplate applications and solutions. Most things are already out there. It's a matter of bringing them together in a seamless and effective way for your business customers. You have to champion the idea that disposability equals flexibility, and that's why the term disposable architecture. Flexibility to me basically means not I can use something for anything I want. It means I can change my mind. I was with an organisation a little while back that basically merged with another organisation that had 2 core systems that did the same thing. But they were slightly different business type of domains. So basically what they did was they merged those 2 systems into one, because why wouldn't you do that? All the economics of scale that you get of running one system, less maintenance, yada, yada, yada. 6 months later, the business decided it wanted to sell that business again. Just out of the blue, they got an offer or what have you, I'm not entirely sure. They couldn't actually do it straight away because of the architectural approach was to actually bring those things together. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong. At the time, it actually looked like a really good way of doing it. But because of the timeframes and the way that it was done and the heavy-handed approach, basically the outcome was the technology was controlling the business decisions instead of flexibility. Now, I'm not saying that everything, as I said many times, this doesn't apply to everywhere. But if your apps are disposable and you're treating your data as king, as I've mentioned, and you need to sell a piece of your business unit or you need to split it off for some reason, simple. You haven't overinvested, you haven't created too much debt, and because of the principles that you've applied, you can very quickly and effectively move that business capability on or to a different area. Start with your development or product selection team. So basically, as I said, sit down with your really kick-ass developers and say to them, what can you guys do in a really small amount of time these days that I couldn't do 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even 2 years ago? You know, be enthused by some of these frameworks that are available these days. Like I mentioned, if you load up MVC3 with Razor, the new Microsoft implementation of MVC, it pretty much comes with an app out of the box. And I'm actually doing a talk on Friday where I can just change some annotations on some classes, which is basically my business rules, and the whole app just responds. It basically becomes the embodiment of my business rules. And I'm talking literally half hour to an hour of effort. Now, of course, I'm not going to deploy that into production straight away, but there's no way I could have done that 10 years ago, even a couple of years ago. And so I really encourage you to spend time with the guys that are innovating like that. And the product selection team, it depends on how large your organisation is. It might even be the architects themselves. You know, start looking at SaaS type of offerings. Start looking and pushing those boundaries further and further out, because you just don't know. If you spend a lot less time on these smaller projects that let's classify them as disposable, you're going to have a lot more time to work on the things that really excite you. Create the political space for solutions to be temporary is one of the main criteria. How many of you have ever looked at a list of requirements from your business and one of the criteria was disposability? One person, cool. And that's a shame, because, you know, I mean, it might be the conclusion I'm drawing, but disposability is flexibility. As I mentioned before with your phones, you know, I know it's not software, but the fact is, if I'm on an 18-month contract with my phone and a new phone comes out, I can switch pretty easy. I don't mind, because I haven't overinvested. I haven't spent all that money, and often the phone companies will help you with that. They'll actually give you offers and what have you to keep you on their plans. That's actually really hard to do, though. I'll be honest. Creating the political space, if you get this stuff and it's interesting to you and you're thinking, hey, you know what, I'd like to start implementing this, that is really difficult. And the reason is that people are going to attach themselves to the way that they have been thinking for the last 10, 15 years. When you come to somebody and you basically say, you know what, the way you've been thinking is fantastic and it's applicable, but it's not always applicable. There's also an alternative. That can create real friction. So if you do decide to take this on, be prepared for some head kicking. And part of the way to do that is draw on all examples around you. Access and Excel have been powering organisations for 10 to 15 years. I was lucky enough or unlucky enough to be part of an audit team that our primary goal was to identify how many Access databases there were in production in an organisation. About 7,000 staff in this organisation. We got to 5,000 and we gave up. Now, it sounds unrealistic, but the fact is we could have just kept on going forever. The fact is there's so many, and you know, they vary in importance. There might only be 20 or 30 really core, and as I said, it depends on the size of your company. But the fact is the company's got to where they are on Access and Excel. Why do we assume that they can't go to where they want to go on Access and Excel? We have this idea that companies' performance, and if you think profit and loss, customer value, is based on good architecture. But some of the most profitable companies I've worked in have had close to zero architecture, and some of the least profitable companies I've worked in have had amazing architecture. And so if we're truly interested in business outcomes, then architecture being perfect and good is not an indication of profitability and those other characteristics. You can't have a talk about architecture without a pattern. I know it's early, but sorry, without a diagram. Basically, all I'm trying to say is that this dotted line is what I think disposable architecture is suitable for. A couple of years ago, it would have probably been just in the mustard area, but you can actually even implement disposable services. If you've got a situational app and you want to service enable it just because that's the design pattern you want to use, well, why not create a service that's situational? That's what application services are. But people sort of seem to think, well, they're not disposable, but the fact is they are. If your service is powering your situational app, there's no chaining, it's essentially a one-to-one, and you're just saying, I want to talk from my client to my server using REST, for example. Well, there we are, you have a disposable service, and that's part of the integration layer. And as you can see, still being very respectful of all of these heavy hitting items, mastering data, finance information. I'm not sure that disposable architecture is right for that space yet, look, but that may change. Like all patterns, things evolve. And I think if there's a bit of a knock on any of the existing patterns that are out there, SOA being one of them, is to a degree it's sort of stopped evolving. It was so complicated that people have become experts in what SOA is and not what it could have been or what it can become. And so to a degree, it's almost got a bad name. Most people now understand that SOA, as it's traditionally seen, is not necessarily an achievable outcome. Just some human nature things, not the band, but people. New staff will always want to do it their own way, so why not build that into your architecture? If you're a good architect, good designer, good builder, you know what you're doing. You're good because you're good. There's no two ways about it. You come into an organisation, you want to share that with your team. You want to show that you've got value. You don't want to just pick up some artefacts that somebody else has spent 3 years building and just basically follow a checklist. You want your personality, you want your life to be in that. And so if you want engaged staff, if you want people to actually feel like they're contributing, understand that they're going to want to do it their way, and so create an architecture framework that allows them to express that. There's always the non-negotiables. There's always things that you can list that people can't do. But if they're a good architect or a good designer and they want to do those things, well, they're not really that good, are they? So good architecture comes down to really good people. You can take a crack team of architects, designers, and developers with no architectural patterns that are mandated, and they will produce good results. You can also take a really average team and give them absolutely every bit of assistance you can imagine when it comes to architectural frameworks, and they can still produce crap results. Encourage the adoption of new technology and systems, with the primary motive being business value, not technical preference. You know, we're not creating Picassos as architects. We don't need to stamp ourselves on these projects and say, I know everything about this domain, this is the way it has to go. Nearly every single piece of software that I've been involved in, that I've developed, within 6, 12, 18 months, someone's built a better version than what I implemented. That's not because I'm not good at my job. That's just because that's the nature of the beast. IT is moving so quickly. The moment you think and you dig your heels in about a way of doing something because you think you're right, you know, the industry's going to pass you by. There still might be pockets, like there are in all different domains, where you can be somebody that says, this is the right way and it's the only way and I'm doing it this way regardless. But the fact is, as architects, we need to be broader. And as I said before, connect. You need to be able to take that on. Now, that might not be a domain that you're interested in, and obviously the bigger the company, the more specialised you become. But the fact is, something like Connect actually bleeds into finance. It bleeds into retail. It can bleed into anything. So you might be in a domain where you think that flexibility isn't important, but the fact is, new technologies are coming out all the time, and it's going to become very important. And another piece, technology debt exists no matter what. Get over it, spend as little as you can to achieve the smooth adoption of technology your organisation is demanding. If you want to be judged as an architect, basically the thing that you should be judged on is, have you made the experience for your business customer as best as possible when deploying your solution? If you think of you're going to build a house and you hire an architect, of course you want good plans and all those things, but if they're assisting you with the transition, you want it to be a good experience. They've actually got to make you feel comfortable, educate you, and help you along the way. Alrighty, questions? And the man up the front has quite a few, I'm sure. But firstly, thank you very much. I know it was early. I'm surprised I didn't fall asleep halfway through myself. But look, really encourage you to fill out the questionnaires online and what have you. And I think I've got 10 minutes of questions. I'll just go with the gentleman.
My comment was, it's just the danger that people will become attached to those applications. Business units will like them so much they won't want to change. So they are throwaway but not. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. So the question was, if people get attached to the actual applications that you developed, so you build something for them, disposable, and they say, hey, we actually really like using this. So my question back would be, why would you throw it out? Why wouldn't you just keep it forever?
Yeah, but then it needs to be maintained, it needs to be interfaces with, so there are complexities you didn't take into account when you built it, thinking just throw away.
That's right. So what you do is, if the return on investment is there, so basically, if you've got a disposable app and the business requirements change and the business is saying, we want what you've already built for us, but we want more, so we want to integrate with other systems. You only spent a small amount up front, throw it away, use that as your business template for what you want to do next, and rebuild it. Build another bigger disposable app. So it's infinitely scalable. And if you looked at my slides about when does something become indisposable, there's no shame in saying, hey, we built a disposable app 12 months ago. Now it needs to be developed using the traditional enterprise architecture approach. So you can transition from disposable to indisposable, and you have a great business template. Yeah, so throw it away, but keep the good out of it. Sorry? Yep. Oh, sorry, there's a guy behind you. Yes? You had a question, sir? Sorry, did you have a question?
Partly a question, partly a comment.
Yep.
Many years ago, I encountered the term battle architecture.
Battle, was it?
Battle.
Okay, I haven't heard that one.
I think it came from the old military academy of no strategic plan survives the conflict of political enemy. And the logic was that headquarters, which is your, in our case, our architectural team on back end shouldn't try to be running what's actually happening in the battlefield. The actual partner that hits the business, they should be saying, well, that's going to be what it is. We have to deal with the problem that's there right now because the enemy are shooting you up. Well, you don't have time to say, well, we won't return fire because we're not supposed to be actually engaged at the present moment.
That's a really good point.
What the headquarters have to do, solar environment, is say, well, okay, that's happening, that's a reality.
Yep.
How can we just make sure that we put that into the overall rather than trying to control it and chase it? I think what's happened with solar is the headquarters are busy trying to actually take over from the man at the metal front.
That's a really good analogy, battle architecture. It's provocative. I really like it. So you had a question? All right.
Excellent example of the previous one is like Excel and Access time, which is similar to disposable architecture.
Yep.
Wouldn't that be the next 10 years when we're talking about this as the same thing?
The difference is that Access and Excel, so the question was, sorry, if this is similar to Access and Excel, which it is from an outcome perspective, but if you think the continuum of 0 being Access, disposable apps being 5, full enterprise architecture being 10. Today, okay, that's right. In 10 years, you probably will find disposable apps all over the place, and you'll be saying, geez, I can't believe we did that 10 years ago. But like my last slide, you're going to have architectural debt no matter. That 25-year-old system that I was trying to help decommission, when that was implemented, that was like $10 million system. 25 years later, people are pulling their hair out the same as they are about the Access databases. So all I'm saying is it's a transition. It's not a 0, it's not a 10, it's actually a 5. And in the battle context, it's a very apt analogy. On the ground, when you're fighting, which is what a lot of business units are, you want the best compromise of long-term and short-term. And disposable architecture is pitched at trying to create the space so that it's okay to do that. Situational.
Which isolated CRM application.
Yep.
Do you not have a duplication of data, for example?
Yes.
In my unit, we have 5.
So, sorry, how long have I got, sorry, with the talk? 5 minutes? Cool, sorry.
5 or odd groups which share a single customer information.
Yes. So as I mentioned, if you need to chain them together, if there's a reliance from one business unit to share data with another, not common as in not business, customer name, address, whatever, but actual data, then you're chaining them together. And so therefore you're not going to apply this pattern to that.
So in that case, there won't be many applications.
Sorry?
There won't be many business case applications, especially the CRM. I'm really surprised.
I think you will be surprised if you give your business unit the opportunity to have something today that does 80% of what they need, or wait 3 years, potentially 2 years, depending on the size of your organisation, for the full-scale system and every business unit to be hooked up. I think you'll find they'll take the compromise today because they're already compromising. They've already got the scrapbooks, they've already got the Excel spreadsheets, they've already got the Access databases, but they're front office risks. They're on network drives that the architecture team probably knows nothing about. You build them a situational app, that doesn't integrate the whole business, but it solves their domain problem, which is often a workflow type scenario. I'm processing information. And yes, you do get duplication of customer data, but you get point-in-time duplication. So at the time I'm dealing with customer A, I might ask them their name, address, date of birth, and I store that in our system, following a convention. So this is the way we store data. Point in time, that's their details. 12 months later, the details change. We have a new point-in-time record. You then can compare those point-in-time records for your data matching because you followed a configuration. All businesses have point-in-time data about their customers and their employees all over the place. It just isn't real to say that we have a single source of truth for a piece of information. You might have a single source of perceived truth, a core system that you go to, and there's no reason that your disposable CRM can't actually have an indisposable service layer that has your customer data, and then you have your domain-specific data stored in your situational app, and it just calls the CRM for the customer ID, and then you correlate. That's another effective way of doing it. So it's really about it's about the principles and the philosophy around it. The way you actually choose to implement it will be based on the resources and the services and what have you that you have available in your organisation.
It has a place, but this is not a blanket solution.
Exactly right. I totally agree. This is, I hope that was clear. I'm but no way saying everyone should go home back to their organisations and say everything's disposable, bang. No. This is very, but what that diagram at the end, the sweet spot, was trying to show is that 2 or 3 years ago, you might have had 10% of opportunities to apply this. I think now it's probably about 50% of projects.
It becomes part of your best practices.
That's correct. It's another tool. Just like SOA was supposed to be another tool, but it became something else. Component-based architecture, been around for 20 years, like it doesn't, but people don't refer to it as a tool. It's sort of like, oh no, we've got to do SOA. Well, you don't. You just, good separation of concerns, things like that. Sorry, sir. Probably got 1 more minute, so 1 more question. Did you? Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, so in your example, where you have lots of business units saying, oh, look, this is great, we want that, and copying it, had another project going on in the background, which was trying to create a holistic, albeit, hopefully better solution globally with core data and everything else. How do you then sell to those business units? Oh, we've got the great one down here now, we need some money from you.
Exactly right.
To help pay for that, but they said, but we've already got what we want.
Yep.
It's what's the pitch?
So the fact that you need a pitch says to me, why would you ever invest in a strategic solution? And that's when I talk about those tipping points. Hey, we as the architecture team or the front office or whatever, the back office guys, decided you needed a CRM that was enterprise-wide. The business didn't ask for that. You didn't go and talk to every single person on the ground and say, hey, what do you need? And the first thing they said was CRM. What they said was, we need to be able to basically track our interactions with our customers. Our interactions, very domain specific. This business unit talks to them about something completely different. I might need to know a little bit about what they're talking to them about, but most likely they've come to me as a customer, they've asked me for something, I'm now responding and following up, and I need to track that for compliance reasons and quality customer service. And so what you end up with is a really interesting tension. And exactly what you're talking about happened. What you will find is if you are successful with this and you roll out 10 CRM domain apps or whatever it is, and the strategic solution is chugging away, very soon they will start to look to shut you down because it is a threat to their business model. That project has become a business in itself. It needs a return on investment. The board have signed off $100 million or whatever it is on this big project. They need to see tangible KPIs. And in the corner, you're creating all this value for very little effort, and what you'll find is that you'll be attacked because the days, in my opinion, and it's just my opinion, the days of those big, holistic, enterprise-wide projects are very, very numbered. Sometimes I get rung up by agents, recruitment agents, as I'm sure we all do from time to time. We've got this really big project I want you to work on. No, I can't. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to work on one of those projects. And a really interesting example is the NBN. Some people in the room are probably fans, some people aren't. It's not that I'm a fan or that I'm not, but right now, because of the return on investment in NBN, Telstra are now banned from promoting alternative wireless technologies. So, once again, you've got the big strategic NBN, which I'm sure will be fantastic to have gigabit Ethernet. I want that like anybody. But the fact is, because it's become political, because it's a large investment, any innovation that CSIRO do around wireless technology, like CSIRO invented wireless N technology. They've made millions of dollars out of it. Basically, if they come out with a gigabyte wireless technology, the government's not going to support them because how can they? How can they get the return on the investment? Why would you sign up for a fibre optic cable if I've got a wireless device that does the same speeds? And so by mandating these large projects, you're actually taking away an opportunity for people to innovate, and you're mandating business outcomes that are actually got nothing to do with the original intent. That's all I've got time for, guys. I'll be just outside if you want to continue talking.